piece of land justice so you can grow food in your backyards. And I'm kind of jumping through some of this stuff really fast, but I want to say that when we talk about food security, land justice is a preceptor to that whole process. We have to be able to control our food. If we can't control our land, we can't control our food, we can't control our health. You've got to have the land. How do we do that? These are some of the things. And I want to say yesterday, my paper had been an article that I wrote for my alma mater, William Mitchell Law School. It was published in their law review yesterday. So if you go on their website, just Google William Mitchell Law School Law Review. It's the second issue. And it's under, I was inspired by Chokwe Lumumba. And I entitled it, what he so famously said, Free the Land. Free the land. Free the land. Oh, there it is. Okay, so that's what it is, but I just want to hit some policies. If you're going to deal with getting our food justice during a time of climate insecurity, we have to have it underneath the auspice of human rights. Incorporate the United Nations Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous People, Article 26, providing the right to lands, territories, and resources which have been traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used and acquired by colonial and now settler governments of the United States. Meaningful consultation with tribal nations and leaders whose homelands the city is built upon. And United Nations Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Okay? So if people have special measures need to be taken to secure land for the people, we need to be looking at those things. Other things, government vacant property. If there's vacant government property held, convert it. Government can convert that into some sort of land trust so we can have land access in a community format. Convert vacant private property held by corporations, and the governments can consider using their power of eminent domain, much like they use and have given to corporations that want to build pipelines through the United States. Once again, the government needs to address the issues of home ownership disparities, and they need to do it now, and they need to actually provide programs where there's no subprime mortgages, and there's down payment, closing costs, and other resources so people can own their homes, specifically geared to those that lost their homes during the 2007-2008 economic crisis. I want to say this, as much as African descendants have a love for the African continent, indigenous people have the same love for the Americas and the Caribbean. These are our homelands. And there's so much history here. We find ourselves in the time of climate change, the destruction of our planet, the disparities we feel, the incarceration rates we see with our brothers and our sisters, the infant mortality rates that we experience with our Native children, African American children. There's so much going on. And I know that if you disconnect us from their land, we are disconnected from who we are and our strength. So I really want to implore that we keep on fighting and looking at how we can make things better by fighting for our rights to have the land we need to supply for food for us in the coming challenges that we have from climate change. In the words of Chokwe Lumumba, free the land, free the land, free the land. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that sobering presentation. Unfortunately, she has to go, so no time to continue that dialogue, but I'm sure the panel will consider those thoughts as we discuss the issues further. Now we'll have Dr. Kwesi Densu, Assistant Professor of Political Science for the A&M, make his presentation.
No. close this right here. I'm going to try to make my comments brief as he suggested, 5 to 10 minutes. That's going to be a little tough for me for a number of different reasons. I had anticipated reading parts of the paper, but I think what I need to do, Dr. Benjamin talked about earlier this idea of how do we frame the question, or how do we understand theoretically what we're talking about when we speak of things like food security, engendering sustainable food systems, a term I like to use now, this idea of food sovereignty. And I think that's an important issue, how we see things. The context for my discussion, though, is very personal. In many ways, this is the 12th annual symposium. I remember the first one, and I was actually a graduate student at CAU in the Department of Political Science when the effort started to bring Dr. Rodney's papers to the archives, and I think Dr. Young was a part of that as well. And I remember collecting and copying many of Dr. Walter Rodney's works and talking to Mrs. Rodney about the idea of bringing the papers here. So now to come back in the C. Woodruff Library and to see the symposium and how it's evolved is a great pleasure. So I'm kind of born and bred and grew up a lot in this space. And during that period, I also became, while I was at CAU, I became deeply interested in the land question and the environmental history and politics of black folk. And at the same time, I became an organic farmer. I used to have a market garden in Monroe, Georgia, north of here. And while I was in graduate school and I had a newborn, I used to drive an hour to work that space, but that didn't work and I had to bring it closer. I ended up in South Fulton. And I was in Atlanta for about 16 years before I ended up in Tallahassee, Florida. And as I was engaged in that work as an emerging scholar, but also a farmer, I was always extremely concerned that the food movement, as people often like to call it today, was deeply entrenched in whiteness. In practical terms, who controlled land, purchasing power, food movement organizations, public policy, etc., seemed to always be controlled by people of European descent. But also at the ideological level, how we perceive and understand terms like sustainable development, local economies, organic and sustainable agriculture, solidarity economies. All of these things seem to be talked about outside of the cultural context and historical experiences of people of African descent. In the literature that is written about food movements and the history of agriculture and sustainable development and the land question, our views seem to always be absent. So it wasn't just we were absent in the literature, but we were also absent in the local markets where people were growing food. It was almost as if we didn't produce food, and we also didn't produce any meaningful ideas. And this concerned me. So I began to engage in the work of what I like to say or call this idea of developing the cultural basis for sustainable agriculture among African communities in the diaspora. That is to say, if we were to look at it through our historical experiences, our contemporary problems, our ideas, both pre-colonial, prior to chattel slavery and colonialism, and the post, what I like to call Maafa experience. How would that look? And would it be something different from what we see in the contemporary food movement? And that was important. So in order to do that, Dr. Walter Rodney became important. I remember one of the first books I read was How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And I had a stack of books, and my father saw the books. He was an activist, and he was looking through them. And he showed me How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and he said, here, this will develop you. Almost like he was giving me the seminal text that was going to change my life. And how I looked at it then was based on my training in political economy in this department. So when I first read it, I was at one space. But then when I became a farmer, I read it very differently. And that's what much of my conversation is about. And I'll just try to give you the salient points. All development philosophies, economic development philosophies, contain within them preconceived notions of what it means to be a human being, and by extension, what constitutes human socioeconomic development. Historically speaking, approaches to the study of African people and pre-colonial African socioeconomic formations have been largely shaped by what can be described best as modernist ideologies. Inherent in this approach is the assumption that as human communities are perceived as more developed, they advance in a linear fashion away from quote-unquote peasant modes of production and social organization. And in an almost unquestioned fashion, this movement from the countryside to the city has been a defining feature of modernist development strategies, both radical and neoliberal. In addition, this progression is almost always associated with increasing the consumption habits of the given migratory population. This preoccupation with rural to urban migration and its attendant linkages to mass consumption is what I like to call the urban bias. And the urban bias can be summarized in 4 basic concepts. The first is the idea that the mark of an advanced society is the degree that you remove people from rural life in a general sense, agrarian life in particular. The second idea is that urbanization is a principal feature of developed societies. The third feature is that high levels of technological development, which we typically associate with industrialization, and in the context of the food system, the Green Revolution, and mass consumption are principal features of developed societies. And then the fourth feature is that pre-colonial and pre-modern socioeconomic and technological formations are primitive. This is particularly true of communities that emerge out of the cultural and historical experiences of indigenous people of color. Now, central to Walter Rodney's work in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa was to do 2 things. One was to actually define the concept of development. The second was to talk about the relationship between Europe's overdevelopment and Africa's underdevelopment as a function of colonialism and chattel slavery. But what we do know is that the analysis in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa was driven by a Marxist framework. And in simple terms, how many people in here are students at all? Okay, many of you. In simple terms, Marxism posits this idea that all societies kind of evolve along this particular track, from communal society to feudal society to slave society to communism. And communism is theoretically somewhere where people have never been. And at each stage of development, particularly from the feudal stage to the communist stage, there's this advance in technological development. And that's a good thing. But the bad thing is it creates extra. And since human beings can be quote-unquote greedy, this extra is struggled over. So you end up having this conflict between the haves and have-nots, even while technology is evolving, or quote-unquote human beings' supposed